It will really have to be all elder peoples. Everybody that are older, that know what it's like to have the value of neighbors, because neighbors come from the value of a person, not what a person have. So today you would just have to go in your neighborhood and look at the elderly, and those are really will be your neighbors today.
It's just those who are, in your immediate surroundings. Again, like the public library, we often kind of situate ourselves right next to them, just for this specific neighborhood I'm talking about. So just those who are immediately around you.
And
A neighbor, a good neighbor.
well, any neighbor.
I would say a good neighbor is someone who actually looks out for you. If you leave their town, they'll watch your house for you instead of letting people know you're gone and having somebody break in it for you. So just looking out for one another, trying to keep one another safe. If something sounds unfamiliar, check on one another just to make sure everything is okay.
Well, in the literal sense, it would be the person that lives next door to me. But yeah, literally, that's what it means.
It's funny that you say that, because that is absolutely true. I guess our neighborhood is becoming redefined, because it's no longer just those who are physically in your presence. It's people who you're talking to on a regular basis, and social media is kind of taking in on some of that space that would have normally been person to person and physically in front of people. I guess I hadn't thought about it that way.
No,
Or have you ever thought that way? And why not?
I never really thought that way. I guess just because they're too far away. Most neighbors are kind of like 2 doors down, maybe 3 doors down, or right next door. So no, I never really gave that much thought, but I don't consider somebody who's like 25 miles away or 1,500 miles away a neighbor.
Okay,
No.
so who is my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? That question is so stinking easy to answer that it's almost silly, right? The folks on the video, it was great. Did you see the woman there? Her name is Linda, the one who said, well, in the literal sense, a neighbor is the person who lives next door to you. And then you could tell her wheels were turning because she wanted to say some other sense, and she said, yeah, that's it. That's what it means, a little. That's it. It's so obvious who's my neighbors. People live next to you, duh. But if you were here last week, we're not going to let you off that easy. It's just the person who lives next door. Go and have a good time. See, last week we talked about this whole concept that the neighborhood itself and what that means has changed. I said last week that it's time for a bigger definition of the word neighborhood, that it's time to recognize that, again, if the whole world belongs to God, and Jesus is the Lord of all of it, is at the center of it, and Jesus became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood, John says, and that doesn't mean a physical location, it means the entire world, then the world and everything in it belongs to God, and that is the neighborhood. And so along that line of thinking, everything would be our neighborhood. Anywhere where you meet other people, physical, digital, virtual, whatever, it's all the neighborhood. Now, we're not ranking neighborhoods. It's just different kinds of neighborhoods. So if you follow that line of thought, then the answer to who is your neighbor becomes kind of an easy question to answer. If the world is the Lord's and everything in it, and Jesus is the Lord of all things, and all of it in some way is our neighborhood, then who are your neighbors? You're free to answer. Everybody. Piece of cake, right? You win. Except, I don't think for a second that you actually believe or act like everybody is your neighbor. I know I don't. Definitely don't. So maybe the question for us this morning, and the best question as we start to rethink neighborhood and neighbor, is not who is your neighbor, but how do you even start to see people as your neighbor? What does it take to see other people who are not next door to you as your neighbors? So how do you start to see other people as your neighbors? To answer that question, let's go to an unlikely place. The school bus. Did you ride the school bus? How many of you here rode the school bus? Amen. School bus riders. I rode the school bus from kindergarten until the end of 6th grade. I was thrilled to be off of the school bus at that point. That's when Mom could start driving me to school. That was a good day. But I had a lot of good school bus experience. The school bus is a great place. It's like a laboratory for basic human behavior. If you wanted to just view humans and see how they treat and mistreat one another, go to the bus. The bus is a good place to do that. So on my bus, we had kind of a social hierarchy. We had a pecking order. And on my bus, the farther back in the bus you were, the cooler you were. So if you were the coolest kid on the bus, you had the very last seat in the back, which was like half a seat, and you had it all to yourself. Nobody got to claim that because you were the coolest kid on the bus. So usually the back of the bus kids were the older kids, been on the bus a little longer. They also were kind of like their families were more socially aware. And they moved in the same kind of social circles. In our area, nobody had super nice clothes or were actually rich or wealthy, but it was the people who were kind of the movers and shakers. Their kids got to go to the back of the bus before other kids did. And then the less cool went to the front, and the younger and all that sort of thing. Well, I remember vividly this day where we were toward the end of our route on the way to school. And I was in 5th grade, and so I had finally just cracked that upper level. I was in the back of the bus, and it was awesome. I remember we made this stop, and the bus was extremely full because we were on the end of our route. Every seat held 3 kids, and all the seats had 3 kids in them already, except for one seat in the back of the bus right across from me. One of my friends was sitting there. I remember we pulled up next to a trailer park. Not a nice trailer park. Just a trailer park. And this kid got on the bus. I don't remember ever seeing him before or since then, but he got on the bus and started to make that walk down the middle aisle. You know, that walk, and has the look of anxiety on the face because there are no seats, looking left, looking right, looking left, looking right. And finally gets to the back of the bus and looks at this open spot and says to my friend, "Can I sit here?" And my friend says those awesome 2 words that we heard on the bus all the time, "Get in." Get in. And he did. So he got in and slid right to the window and just looked out that window. And it's funny how you remember these things, how they get etched in your brain. I remember what he was wearing, that he had kind of this dingy off-white t-shirt, that the neck was all stretched out on it, and he had brownish corduroy pants, and they were a little too baggy. Nothing fit quite right, and it looked like it hadn't really been laundered in a while, and it smelled like it really hadn't been laundered in a while, and he had really, really short hair, crew cut. But you could tell he hadn't paid for the crew cut. That was clippers, and somebody did it somewhere. A little uneven. I don't remember what was said to him, but I remember who said it. It was my friends. And I remember that it was just brutal. It was brutal. If you could point something out and make fun of it on a human being, my friends were doing it. I mean, they were just dressing this kid down over and over again, beating him down verbally, savaging this poor kid who just sat down. And I remember that he didn't say anything back. He didn't move a muscle. He just looked out the window the entire time. And I sat there. I didn't say anything, but I sat there thinking, this just isn't right. Remember, I was raised in the church, Josh. I knew all the Sunday school stories. I knew the lessons because I sat in these children's messages and heard the preacher say, love your neighbor as yourself, and all that wonderful stuff. And I sat there while this kid just got verbally beat up by my friends, and I said nothing. I can imagine Jesus at this point in the story saying, what do you think? Which of these was a neighbor to the child who fell into the hands of the back of the bus group? And the answer would be nobody. Nobody. There was no neighbor for the boy. If you think about this in terms of the parable of the Good Samaritan, my friends were the robbers, and I played the role of the priest and the Levite, the super religious kid who wasn't willing to take the risk to stand up to anything to help the person who was in the ditch. Super religious, knew all the right answers, acted on none of them. There was no Samaritan in the bus story. Of course, in Jesus' parable, there was one. And so there in your bulletins, you have Luke 10:25 through 37. And to get into the meaning of this story, there's all kinds of ethnic and social and religious and historical stuff going on here. But we don't have 4 hours together. So just to get to the root of it, Samaritans and Jews were mortal enemies. They hated each other. There was religious stuff tied into it. There was identity stuff tied into it. They did not get along. They were oil and water. They didn't mix. You get the point. A Samaritan was the last person a Jew in a ditch would expect to help him out. And Jesus, a Jew, was talking to a Jewish lawyer in a Jewish audience, telling this parable, and uses the Samaritan as the neighbor, the hero of the story. The Samaritan, in that time period, was supposed to sneer and chuckle and just keep on walking, but he stopped. Why? Why in the story did that Samaritan stop when the others passed by? And if you look at verse 33, there in the bulletin, it says this: "But a Samaritan was traveling and came near him, and when he saw him," what does Jesus say there? Yeah, he was moved with pity. He was moved. His innards twisted up a little bit. He went from one place in his thinking to another place in his thinking. Another word for pity in the Greek is compassion. He was moved with compassion. The Samaritan was able to see something in the man that moved him past Jew, Samaritan, bad, good. Moved him past that and was able to see that man in the ditch as his neighbor. What he saw is what each of us needs to see to be able to recognize that other people are our neighbors too. Without being able to see this in other people, we will never be able to see people as neighbors or treat them as neighbors. So what did that Samaritan see? He saw himself. He saw himself. He looked at the man suffering in the ditch and saw himself in that ditch. Saw, like a kid on the playground, I remember when I was in a ditch, or in a ditch. I remember when I was in that same situation, or I can see how I, given different circumstances, could find myself in the same exact situation. And he had compassion. He was moved to help that man. That's actually what the word compassion means. Passion means suffer, calm with, to suffer with somebody else, to see your suffering and somebody else's suffering. He saw himself in that man, and it made him that man's neighbor. And does that sound a little unrealistic? You're going to go into the world and look at him and he'll look at her, and they're my neighbor. Yeah, it sounds unrealistic, except it's not, because you've experienced it. Remember just over a year ago when January 2nd, those storms ripped through? We've talked about them ad nauseum, whatever it was, tornadoes, straight line winds, January 2nd, and ripped through most of your neighborhoods. Most of them. And if it didn't get you the first time around, 20 days later it did. And remember the reaction there? It was tragic. I never want it to happen again, but there are parts of it I do want to have happen again. I mean, there was this just instant unity. Nothing mattered. Nothing else mattered except that we shared in one another's suffering. Race, ideology, religion, denomination, political party, none of that mattered. Did anybody ask you that before they helped? Hold up. Baptist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Episcopalian, what do you bring them? I mean, nobody asked me that. Did anybody ask you that before you helped them out? Hold up before you pull that chainsaw. Republican, Democrat, unaffiliated. No. I mean, it was, do you have a chainsaw? I need a chainsaw. Or it was, I have a chainsaw. Do you need a chainsaw? I mean, that was it. It was unity. It was, are you suffering? Do you have a need? I can meet that need. Am I suffering? Can you meet that need? That was it. It was compassion on full display. And now that was in our physical neighborhoods, but it is not just limited to physical neighborhoods, and it wasn't even in that whole thing, remember? The digital places came to life with neighborly love in that time. There were Facebook check-ins telling the world we were okay, if we were okay, and then some didn't check in and we could go look at them. It was people posting, this is the neighborhoods I'm going to today. Will you join me there? Or it was somebody getting on Facebook, maybe they were charging their phone in their car and saying, I'm in this neighborhood, we could really use some help. There were Facebook pages set up. Here's drop-off points, A, B, C, D. This is where you can bring stuff. It was the world working together in all these different facets. The neighborhood came alive in Albany, the whole neighborhood, physical, digital, everything across all these lines. And people were neighbors. If only for a moment, we were neighbors. And I say if only for a moment because you know that kind of stopped happening, right? And in a lot of ways we've reset to what we were before. And I actually wrote that line in this sermon in August, anticipating that when I gave this sermon in February that would be the case. Sad to say, nailed it. That's human nature. But while we're talking about human nature, you heard me read the creation story from Genesis 1, 26 through 28. God created humankind in His image. In the image of God, He created them. That image of God is what makes us human. It is our human nature. It's the one thing that we all share. No matter what our dividing lines or anything else, we all share the image of God. We just do. It's in everybody. Theologians would say that last year we were able to cut through all the stuff that separates us, and we were able, whether we could acknowledge it or not, or said it or not, we were able to see the image of God in one another, and to honor the image of God in one another. We saw humanity in other people, and we acted on that humanity because we're connected in that way, in ways that we don't even understand. We went to the core of it because we had no choice, and we acted. We looked at other folks and saw people. That was what happened. You saw other people as your neighbors instinctively, and it changed everything. Now, it's not easy to keep that going. That's why it's not going. Or it's not going in the same way. Or we're still talking about how great it would be if it had kept going. It's not easy. But that's why Jesus told the parable of the Good Samaritan in the first place. It's not easy. It's extremely difficult. And His words to the lawyer are His words to us today. Go and do likewise. Go and do likewise. Go into the neighborhood and see people as your neighbors. The people you bump into everywhere are your neighbors. Whether you're having a conversation on the street with a stranger, or you're texting a friend, or you're responding to a post on Facebook. In this changed world, it's all your neighborhood, and these are your neighbors. The world needs people who know that, who acknowledge that truth and go and do likewise. Who are able to see past the differences and all the stuff and see humanity and see the image of God and act on that, honor that. So over the next 2 weeks, we're really going to dig into how we do that. If we see this stuff as our neighborhood and if we see other people as our neighbors, then how do we actually act on that? How do we do it? So that's going to be a fun conversation and kind of an interesting one. How do we do that in all these different pieces in the neighborhood? I'll tell you what, since that day on the bus in 5th grade, I have wondered what happened to that boy. I mean, Where did he go? What did he do? Where is he today? I promise you, I have spent hours on Facebook and on Twitter and Googling, trying to find this kid, and I don't even know what he looks like. I don't know his name. I just know where he lived when he was a kid. And I haven't been able to find anything, but I hope someday I will. Because that kid is my neighbor. And I see that now. I wish I saw it then. The image of God is in him, the same as it's in me, the same as it's in you. We share that, we're connected, we have that in common. Even if we have nothing else in common. And because of what happened that day, I don't ever want to pass by on the other side of the street again. I don't want to be the priest and the Levite sitting there knowing all the right answers and doing nothing. I want to be better than that for the sake of Jesus and for the sake of his kingdom. I want to have compassion. I want to be moved. And I want to act. And I want people, when I'm in the ditch, to be moved and to act on my behalf. That's what Jesus wants too, for me and for you and for everybody. That's how his healing and his transformation will come into this world. So may you spend this week ahead moving around this new neighborhood, looking at the people you meet, the ones you know and the ones you've never met, and seeing yourself. Seeing your neighbor. Amen.